We enter a pub sometime in the 1950s, somewhere in southeast London, in the area called Kennington. Inside, it's very crowded. It's a Friday night, full of people letting off steam after a week's work. There's a piano playing in the corner. It's very smoky, the clinking of glasses, somebody singing along with the piano. And in one area, there's a group of people, at the centre of which is an old man. On either side, he's flanked by old acquaintances. But there are also some younger people there. Some of them are better dressed and are staring at him intently, listening keenly to any word that he might utter. The barman calls time, and the crowd begin to leave. We follow the old man as he wends his way through the streets of Kennington until he comes to a house with a flight of steps down to a basement. We follow him down the steps and wait as he opens the door, steps inside. The flat is a cacophony of artists' materials, turpentine, paints, pencils, half-finished drawings, paintings stacked against walls. It also smells. It smells of cats. There are many cats here, and as the old man comes into the flat, they all stare at him strangely. He drops down into a chair, lights a cigarette, pours himself another drink. And as he drinks, he closes his eyes and slips into a reverie. He's dreaming of a younger man, sitting at a table. The younger man takes from his pocket a box, and from the box he takes a pack of strange cards and lays them out on the table in front of him. He stares at them intently. Does he like what he sees? Who is he? Well, we're going to find out in this episode of the Bureau of Lost Culture. I'm Stephen Coates. Welcome, or welcome back, if this isn't the first time here. I'd like to invite you, before we begin, to join us at bureauoflostculture.com. You can sign up for our newsletter. You can support us in our wild endeavours, just as Tom, Stevie, Rob and Pip did again this month. Thank you so much, guys. We appreciate that. Now, as regular listeners know, there's nothing we like better at the Bureau of Lost Culture than a tale of lost culture. And what a tale we have today. It's a tale, actually, in some respects, of a lost person and of a lost object. The lost person is the London artist and mystic Austin Osman Spare. And the object, the lost object, is, well, we'll hear about the lost object in due course. And the person who's going to tell us about both isn't lost, he's here in Soho with me, is the artist and curator Jonathan Allen, editor of the book Lost Envoy, about both person and objects and about all sorts of other stuff. Welcome, Jonathan.
Hello. We last met in a cemetery, I think, weren't we? Isn't it something, Brompton Cemetery?
I think it was, yes, surrounded by spirits and ghouls, but in that amazing building.
I can't remember, actually, whether it was that occasion or another one, when Alan Moore was there.
I don't think it was on the same day, but it was maybe the day after. The same period.
Yeah, because I just realised actually when reading your essay, of course, that Alan was become quite involved with Austin Spare. And sort of fictionalised him in Prometheus, that I completely wasn't aware of that.
Yes, there's some great illustrations of him sort of becoming this time-travelling savant across the ages, and he appears in the book, which is why we invited him in part to contribute to the book that we will talk about a bit later on.
Yeah, and also, of course, this connection with chaos magic. I'm not even quite sure what that is, but I mean, there's why don't we jump in, and I'm going to deal you a set of cards, as we're talking about the tarot.
Okay.
And I thought that we can just talk about each of those cards. So the first card I'm going to deal you is a card, and it's got a picture of you on it, Jonathan Allen. So who is Jonathan Allen?
Well, I'm a London-based artist, writer, and sometimes curator. I trained as a visual artist back in the late 1980s. I've been exhibiting and writing, making lots of different kinds of exhibitions around my own practice, but also in the context of, I had a particular interest over the years in I suppose the creative potential of archives and museum collections, research activities that reanimate or reboot creative projects that were somehow overlooked or missed or incomplete or misplaced somehow.
Which is a perfect subject for this Bureau of Lost Culture, obviously, because we love stories that are kind of lost or half hidden or half remembered. And this story, as we're going to find out, is full of that word lost, isn't it? But I don't know if you still are, but you were curator at the Magic Circle Museum.
Sometime around 15 years ago, I following this interest in collections and archives, but also picking up on what had been a long-term interest in the technology of illusion and spectacle. I started working closely with the Magic Circle Museum. I mean, recognizing that theatrical magic, or some I've called it secular magic, has kind of slipped through the cultural net to a large extent. Its cultural history, particularly until recently.
And that's an important distinction, isn't it? So you talk about theatrical magic, or conjuring, I suppose we might sort of say, which is, doesn't claim to have any sort of mystical aspects to it, as distinct from magic, possibly with a K, which is very much claiming that you can change the world via various rituals or or through divination and stuff like that. So your interest was in the former as something which has been maybe not taken so seriously as a art form, is it?
Yeah, well, I think partly it's just been more culturally invisible. I mean, that's
Right.
partly because magicians have deliberately hidden that history.
Right.
Because magic as a theatrical form relies, for better or worse, on a degree of secrecy. In fact, magicians talk about hiding the secrets of magic on behalf of their audiences. Rather than in some kind of battle of sort of power over their audiences.
The delight in witnessing a trick is in not understanding how it's done, and therefore, if you've got full knowledge of how it's done, you lose some of the entertainment of it, right?
Yeah, that's partly. I mean, a lot of people, engage with magic really, really wanting to know how it's done,
Right.
and the kind of curiosity around the processes of illusion and spectacle are increasingly important at the moment, given that there are lots of I wouldn't call them magicians, they're probably confidence tricksters in popular culture and political culture who use and draw on some of the methods that magicians use in a theatrical context. So being able to decipher what's going on is of great interest to some. But just going back to your original point about the sort of this distinction between theatrical magic and magic with a K that derives from a sort of supernaturalist or otherworldly tradition. I don't really see the two in such stark contrast. I mean, if you look back through the history of secular magic, there's all sorts of people who are practicing in the theatrical arts who are deeply interested in the esoteric dimensions of psychic experience, and in fact, the Magic Circle has a thing called the Occult Committee that actually was set up I think it was in 1914 as part of the Magic Circle, to investigate experiences or claims for supernatural processes and events. That period was also full of lots of charlatans and lots of people who were sort of, I guess, opportunists around what was also a genuine exploration of psychological and psychic experiences that people were investigating and trying to form into the occult sciences at the time. So the idea of this kind of collision between the rational and the irrational isn't so clear.
Okay, so listen, I'm going to deal you your second card, which is the Magic Circle. So for anybody who doesn't know what that means, or has just maybe heard something about it vaguely, what is it?
The Magic Circle is essentially a kind of membership club for theatrical magicians. It was founded in London in 1905, basically as a space where performers could get together away from their audiences and share ideas and perform to each other. And there's a club room, fully equipped theatre, very extensive library covering all aspects of the conjuring arts, an archive, and an amazing museum comprised of theatrical props that are often left by magicians to the magic circle, because obviously the props on loose in the world contain technical secrets that magicians are sort of trying to trying to protect to some extent, but also the museum traces a technological progression of around illusion.
My memory of it was that to become a member, obviously you had to be sort of practicing theatrical magician, but also you had to kind of sign up to their sort of secrecy rule, to sort of swear not to reveal the secrets of the either the circle or the tricks. Is that right?
Yeah, I mean, this goes back to what I was saying earlier about magic's about generating experiences of as if of the impossible. A wonderful magic historian called and illusion designer called Jim Steinmeier describes the revelation of theatrical secrets in magic as a formula for disappointment, which I think is quite a nice description.
Very good, yeah, because there's always that thing of like, we want to know how something's done, and then when we find out, we always go, oh. For listeners, by the way, we are building towards the subjects of this episode. I'm going to deal Jonathan another card here, quite appropriately, and that is a picture of a tarot deck. Now, Jonathan, I don't think you're a tarot reader yourself, but you probably know a lot more about it than most people. So what is tarot?
Tarot falls, I suppose, generally within the field of cartomancy. Cartomancy usually describes divination using playing cards. So tarot cartomancy is divination using cards to speculate on a particular experience or particular moment using a set of randomly chosen or laid out cards in spreads. And tarot cards are probably the most celebrated and most well-known example of that. But tarot actually didn't have a divinatory origin. It began the beginning of the Milanese court around the sort of 1450s. And at that point, it was a card game. Cards that were part of that deck were a sort of portrait of the Visconti family who commissioned them, were a sort of allegory of life, all leading towards the kind of celebration of Milan.
So the major arcana are the sort of these 22 cards, right, that maybe people are more familiar with, and then the minor arcana is the 52 card full deck.
It's actually 56. It totals 78 cards, standard tarot deck. So it's 22 major arcana trumps, and the minor arcana is 4 suits of 14 cards each. I mean, it was full of all the humanist, very, very rich humanist iconography of the period.
It's got almost like the feeling of some alchemical grimoires as well.
I guess it feels like that, but that may be because subsequently tarot has been read through the lens of its occultation later on, during 2 main periods, really. I mean, the recreational trick-taking aspects of the tarot were kind of had been forgotten by the time in the French occult revival.
So it's effectively a parlor game, with some depth to it. Then later becomes used for divination, for future telling, for reading meaning into people's relationships, etc. Yeah. As this kind of conversation starter for work about the soul or psyche.
Yeah, well, I mean, but the next sort of period in which it undergoes this sort of next transformation is in London, mid to the end of the 19th century, during the British occult revival. This is the origins of probably the most celebrated deck now, the Rider-Waite-Smith deck.
The deck that most people, if they've seen tarot, will probably be familiar with.
Yes, exactly. Yeah, painted by Pamela Coleman, Pixie Smith. And it's exactly during that period that Austin Spare, who we'll talk about in a moment, hand-painted the deck that, in a strange twist of fate, ended up in the Magic Circle Museum, which I'll tell you about shortly.
Perfect. That's a perfect segue into my next card. And I'm going to put a card down, and on it, it's got a picture of the London artist, Austin Osman Spare. People may be familiar with him, but for anybody who's not, Jonathan, give us a quick bio of Spare.
It's a big complex story. You can help me along on the way.
Well, I mean, I know a lot less about him than you do, but I've been fascinated by him myself. And one of the things is that he was like a working class Londoner, wasn't he? Born and bred in Clerkenwell, I think. Was that right? And
yeah, in Smithfield, actually. Yeah, I mean, Peter Ackroyd has sort of tried to plot this tradition of London Cockney visionaries, which includes, I think, Hogarth,
Blake,
Turner, Blake, exactly, Dickens,
yeah,
and Phil Baker, who wrote a wonderful biography of Spare in 2011, adds Austin Spare to this Cockney visionary tradition. Spare was an English artist born in 1886 in London. He spent most of his life in London, where he died in poverty, essentially, in 1956. He lived through 2 world wars, obviously, as well as massive shifts in art history, into which he never seemed to fit.
Well, Phil gives this great observation. He was an artist who had his career the wrong way round. He began as a controversial West End celebrity because he was fated as a young man, wasn't he?
Yes.
As the next great thing, and went on to obscurity and poverty in a South London basement.
Well, exactly, yeah. I mean, from a very early age, he was seen to be, and was, an incredibly gifted draftsman, particularly drawing the human figure, and it was that talent for drawing that was the source of that early celebrity. His father submitted some of his drawings to the Royal Academy summer exhibition, where they were accepted, and at the time he was still a student at the Royal College of Art,
my old school.
He was very good friends and remained lifelong friends with the suffragette organiser Sylvia Pankhurst.
And I thought I'd just drop this in because I've got one spare thing in my collection, which is I've got an original copy of the Book of Pleasure, and it's got a nameplate in it for Una Troubridge and Ratcliffe Hall, who Una Troubridge was also in his year at the Royal College of Art, so I suspect he probably gave it to her as a present, as a gift, Una Troubridge and Ratcliffe Hall, sort of 2 famous lesbians and authors and artists. He was fated because he was this extraordinary skill of drawing, and he became West End celebrity.
The Darling of Mayfair, he called
Darling of Mayfair, right? Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, he was an attractive, young, flamboyant, highly talented, somewhat controversial figure. The other important thing about him during that period is that he was negotiating and thinking through and claiming that otherworldly forces behind the production of his work, or somehow kind of involved in the production of his work. And I think that's why when Spare gets talked about, there's always this parallel discussion around his virtuosity as a draftsman and his life and activity as an occultist. I mean, I prefer the term mystic.
So he does share something a century or so later with Blake, this artist mystic, also Londoner, Cockney visionary, as you said earlier, and stylistically, maybe the Aubrey Beardsley and even people like Mervyn Peake later, who's an interesting parallel, because Peake also produced an awful lot of work and had to produce a lot of commercial work, in addition, and made his own books as well. Yeah. And part of this fascination with Spare, for a lot of people, I think, is the occult aspect. It appeared early, these claims that he made about the inspiration for his muse, as it were. And he did kind of live it, didn't he, all the way through? He lived both as a sort of working artist and also a mystic, right?
After this sort of early period of celebrity, he's a bit something of an entrepreneur, actually. He publishes 2 high-quality folio books of his own work. But then the war happens, damaged and wrong-footed many artists during the period. Spare became a war artist. He was drafted into the medical corps. There's a really terrifying large pastel drawing in the Imperial War Museum of a gassed soldier sort of trying to be rescued by a medic. That's where most of the institutionally held works of Spare still are, in the combination of the Imperial War Museum and the Wellcome Collection, because of the medical aspect of the work. After the war, I think he didn't have the desire or the education, in fact, to re-enter into the cosmopolitan London art scene. Phil has this wonderful term, the hidden injuries of class caught up with him. He returned back south of the river, essentially, to his working class roots, and he entered into a sort of world of exploration of his own psyche, and this is where the real kind of engine room of his occult practice, I think, thrives. But at the same time, he's drawing local personality,
local working class people, and some sex workers, and also teaching, right, as well. I mean, like Mervyn Peake, he had to sort of make a living, didn't he? And holding these sort of exhibitions in his own flat, in his kitchen, and just inviting people around and selling his works quite cheaply. And
the power of the work, I mean, the drawing is just exceptional throughout this period. I mean, he really could draw this guy.
And I think also in terms of Kennington, there's something really significant because he was drawing locals. He had some favourite characters, didn't he, that he would draw. So it does really bed him as a London artist. And I was just wondering, and we're not really here to delve that deeply into it, but as well as those working class wounds, as it were, your background coming up and swallowing you, was there also a sense that his style, and also the occult stuff, became unfashionable in terms of the modern art movement? What was considered to be the most relevant modern art in the 20s and 30s, and I just wonder also whether his occult activities were regarded with a bit of embarrassment by the art establishment.
He kind of fell in between the art historical movements that he might have been associated with, the figurative drawing in his practice. Obviously, that was out of kilter with the main driving forces of 20th century modernism. Although certain aspects of modernism were projected onto him from outside. So in the 30s, he was described as the London father of surrealism.
Right, okay.
That's a celebrated headline, the father of surrealism. He's a cockney.
Excellent. I mean, and of course, and if he'd been around later, like say in the late 50s and 60s, with the sort of blossoming of psychedelia and stuff, he probably would have been the toast of the town again, wouldn't he?
Yes, exactly. But by then he'd become a bit of a human interest story, a starving artist in the cellar. A couple of his friends kept his name in the press, in order to, so he didn't vanish completely. But it was at that point that the sort of next iteration of his life begins, because through that publicity, Kenneth Grant was sort of inheriting the Aleister Crowleyan tradition that was sort of a continuous magical tradition through from the last century. Went and found him in his cellar, I think it was in Wynn Road in Brixton, recovered his spirits, I think, as much as anything, as well as, spotting his work and bringing it to attention.
Do you think he was feeling quite defeated by that point then?
From all appearances, he was very active and living his self-contained life, but
talking to his cat.
But there's some photographs from that period where there's more cats in the picture than paintings. And
he claimed that they were his familiars, didn't he? Sort of like in a warlock type way.
Encouraged by the Grants.
Yeah, they wanted him to be a mystic, didn't they? More so.
Yeah, and I think Spare played up to it. I mean, it's very interesting, that period for us, looking at the tarot deck that we're going to talk about, because he commits to paper some very interesting thoughts on cartomancy and card reading that actually he hadn't left any evidence of earlier in his life.
And for anybody who hasn't seen Spare's work, check it out online. It is extraordinary. Drawings, paintings, portraits, also these books, that he made with his own writings, and particular artifact which we're going to talk about. I'm going to deal you your next card here, Jonathan, because I'd like you to tell the story of the Austin Spare tarot deck, and really because how you found it. This is a story of lost culture, really, isn't it?
Yeah.
This is a sidebar. It's from a piece called His Own Arcana, Austin Osman Spare and the Borders of Tarot, by Phil Baker, published in the collection Lost Envoy. Who doth know what his own subconscious contains? Still less his own arcana, said Austin Spare. Cards were deeply embedded in Austin Spare's personal mythology. He claimed an old witch called Patterson had initiated him into their mysteries when he was a child. Along with their ability to exteriorise thought forms so that another person could see them taking shape in a corner of the room, and her knack of changing herself from an old hag into a beautiful woman. She taught him to read the cards and foretold his own mixed fortunes. She told me all the major events of my life, he said. More than that, according to Spare, whenever he did a card reading for anyone, it left him so drained that afterwards he wanted to lie down and sleep. But the old lady could tell hundreds without getting tired.
Personally, what I really owe the thanks for sending me off in the right direction is Ben Roberts, who was a curator at Camden Arts Centre. At the end of 2012, he invited me to contribute to a series of public events associated with the obsessive Swiss collector Dieter Roth. Ben wanted me to just talk about my relationship to the collections of the Magic Circle Museum and how they came about. And I had to dig down into the collection. And in doing that, I just stumbled across a reference in the old accession notes of one of the curators from the 1920s, of Arthur Ivy, to a 79 card tarot deck, hand painted in 1910 by the English artist Austin Osman Spare.
That's a sort of classic treasure hunter moment, isn't it? I mean, you're an archivist, you're an artist yourself, right? And then you just read this reference. Does it still exist? Where is it? And
yes.
Yeah, how did that feel?
Yeah, I mean, I can picture the moment as I'm talking to you. Funnily enough, I'd been looking at our playing card collection a couple of months before, just because it's one of the aspects of the collection that has been long archived. It's not on display. It was in a box that said for sale, although it wasn't actually going to be sold, but it was in deep storage essentially. But what that meant was I knew exactly where it was. So within 10 minutes, I had it in my hands.
Wow. So hold on. So you read this reference to it, which you must have sort of hair standing on end sort of type thing. You walked into the archive knowing it's got to be in that box.
Yeah, they opened a locked cupboard. It was going to be in one of three boxes. It was in the first one that I picked, number 172 in the catalogue.
That must have been a moment.
It was. And I should say my recognition of the name Spare, came from past knowledge of his work, but also through Phil Baker's book that had just been published. So he was in my mind, and another pot of Sparian brew had obviously been stirred somehow by that. I was immediately sensitive to, the potential of this object. And then I just spent an exciting couple of hours. There was nobody in the museum for that whole evening. I was there completely on my own. I had that sensation of looking over my shoulder. Is there somebody here with me? And
probably hadn't been opened, had it, or been laid out for decades, if ever, right?
I later did the research to follow the provenance of the object inside the Magic Circle. It had been in the collection about 70 years by the time I found it. It had been displayed in the Magic Circle Museum sometime in the 50s. It's fascinating, the possibility that it was displayed in Spare store. We have no idea, but it could potentially have seen it. The deck mostly was held in an album for particularly special parts of the collection. That I should say that the reason the Magic Circle has a playing card collection is so magicians wouldn't be surprised if handed a deck of cards that had unfamiliar imagery on it and handled in a particular way. So the idea was to have a collection of all existing playing cards, which is a hopelessly endless task. So magicians could come and experiment with them and play with them. But
this deck that you found is the deck that he made. It's not like it's a kind of copy or that he made multiple copies of.
Yeah, 79 hand-painted original artworks by Spare, which is what makes it so extraordinary.
79 miniature paintings, basically. I mean, just to go back to that moment when you started to spread it out or deal it out, that must have been so exciting, right?
It was immediately obvious that there was something different about it in terms of the design.
It's radio, so we have to describe what it might look like as far as possible. Not all 79, but I mean,
there's many things that can be said about this incredible object. It's essentially a relic of the British occult revival, this deck. Curator at the Magic Circle accessioned it as produced in 1910. In our following research, we're pretty sure that was too late. We think it was produced in 1906, around 1906, 1905, 1906.
Which would mean that it would predate the most famous tarot deck.
Predates the Rider-Waite-Smith deck. The reason we think that to do with the iconography in the deck that belongs to a much earlier period of Spare's practice than 1910. By 1910, he's moved on considerably.
This is a sidebar. It's from a piece called Mind to Mind and How by a sorcerer, published in the book Lost Envoy. It's Austin Osman Spare in a piece he wrote for the London Mystery Magazine. Science has to wait, its rare artist, to make an audacious guess for enlightenment or mutation. For me, the inexplicable of beauty, the undivulged of things gives them their enchantment, not their known meanings. From the above evolves a suggestion that the mind knows all, that thought which permeates all things is the conveyor and the nexus, and that we become rapport and evocative by some cryptic symbolism which we must originate. Here's a clue. How do two fraudulent telepathists convey messages to each other? By a leisured domain, some subtle secret code. And the means of psychic correspondence, telepathy, premonition, prediction, is by a parallel. Merely to establish telepathy between two people by known things means little outside of the proof. So we extend to the unknown, i.e. prediction, and by a simple form, anyone may practice and prove for himself. The degree of success must necessarily relate to one's aptitude and ability. First, obtain a book on fortune telling by playing cards. This will give you the general idea towards the making of a far better pack for your purpose. Then procure a pack of ordinary playing cards, mark them top and bottom. Do not rely on the book too much, only for general direction and method, all such being the traditional remnants of a lost art. You must evolve your own meanings, symbols and methods.
The deck, as I laid it out, did I lay it out on the floor? No, I think I laid it out on the top of one of the vitrines because I thought the carpet might be a bit grubby. But the first thing to notice about it is it has a very strange architecture. The major arcana are tarot trumps, but the minor arcana is essentially a deck of hand-drawn playing cards. So normal French suit, hearts, diamonds, clubs, spade, and he's sort of fused them together in a curious hybrid that is very unusual and I think unprecedented as far as I can work out. It hybridizes the two traditions of cartomancy that were concurrent at the time, but during that period, the esoteric tarot was largely the domain of an educated, investigative elite, Order of the Golden Dawn, whereas playing card cartomancy was a working to middle class pastime to some extent.
You might do it in a pub or something, right?
Exactly.
Yeah, parlour game, yeah. And it's quite interesting in his case that he did bring them together and fuse them in that way because, of course, he was also a fusion of that himself, wasn't he? Hanging out briefly with Crowley in the Golden Dawn and then also working this working class artisan type as well, wasn't he? So exactly. He might have played those kind of games in the pub or something in Kennington. So you also talk about the fact that, very unusually, whereas most decks, the cards are all individual, in his deck, if you lay cards next to each other, they overlap from one to another. Is that right?
Yeah, well, this is the thing that jumped out to me immediately and got me very excited when I was looking at them straight away. We're still puzzling out the kind of motives behind this, and I guess we'll never really know why, but if you lay very many of the cards next to each other, either as pairs or as larger groups, Spare drew and wrote across the borders in between the cards. So it's information half on one card and half on another card. So they link together and form an image or form a word, often in a little beautifully drawn banderole. But they don't fit together like a puzzle. It's not like you could sit down and the whole thing join together. It's much more fragmented and chaotic than that. So when some marginal devices link together and form images, other images that are on that same border go nowhere and form dead ends.
So when you discovered it, so you've had this evening on your own at the Magic Circle, a quite magical evening by the sounds of it. Of course, it's a discovery which is going to be fascinating to anybody who's interested in Austin Osman Spare, but also interested in the history of the Magic Circle, and also, I guess, people tarot aficionados, or the occult revival interests as well. It's got this kind of multiple attraction, hasn't it, to various people. So what happened? I mean, you've just found it. What do you do next?
Well, I should add another community to that, which is art historians, because it's obviously a very early example of combinatoric artwork. I mean, it's got the feel of a sort of surrealist, exquisite cadaver game. I always think if Calvino had seen it, he'd have been fascinated by it. Calvino famously, wrote fiction using tarot cards as narrative inspiration, but actually laying these cards together where images are physically produced as they're laid down alongside one another, I think he'd found that extremely interesting.
What happened next for you? So you've discovered it, and then you've got to tell the world about it in some way, right? A very interested world. And
yeah, I mean that's where a sort of wonderful bit of good fortune came in that because of contact with Phil Baker through his biography, and actually I'd known the publisher of that book, Strange Attractor Press. I'd known Mark Pilkington, its director and founder, for many years. I knew immediately I was going to show it to Mark because it seemed a very obvious object around which a publication could revolve.
You had to explain it somewhat to the Magic Circle, didn't you? I mean, it's an object that was in their archive, not lost but forgotten. Maybe they wouldn't understand at first the importance or significance of it in a wider sense to, all these communities that we talked about, right?
There was also an issue around its association with occult thinking and the, slightly undeveloped sense of those cultural histories, the sort of magic versus magick, that kind of thinking doesn't tend to explore the shared imagination between both worlds, the sense of seeking inquiry that both communities explore and share, and so I guess in some ways I was a little bit protective over it. I mean, firstly I needed to check the deck wasn't known about. I did a bit of Googling straight away, and there was nothing significant written about that. It took me about 3 weeks to realize it was a completely unknown work. And by then I'd also traced how it had got into the Magic Circle.
Which was? The
Book of Pleasure that we talked about briefly earlier on, Spare's main third publication in about
1910.
It considered his sort of theoretical, magical masterpiece, his early treatise. In fact, some of his sort of most original, oddest ideas, I think, are in that. But the author of the foreword of that book, artist and writer Ernest Collings, and it turned out that the person who had gifted the deck in 1944 was called Herbert J. Collings, who was a former founding member of the Magic Circle and twice its president, and the younger brother by a year of Ernest Collings. And Ernest Collings had known Spare from a very early age, so it's very likely that Herbert J. Collings also knew Spare. It's almost certainly the conduit through which the deck came to the Magic Circle. Maybe Herbert J. Collings says that Spare gave him the deck.
It is all lost in time, and as you say, we'll never know, but he wrote about cartomancy later. Do you think that he made these cards as an artistic experiment, or do you think that he actually used them in terms of doing readings for any occult purpose? Or
I tend to read the deck as a kind of training deck. When you look at the cards, there's a lot of writing on them, experiments within the deck itself, sort of ideas that he's trying out that he then abandons. The feeling is of a assemblage of learning and exploration around both the esoteric tarot and the long history and lore of playing card cartomancy, all being notated together in this kind of experimental portable studio in miniature that he can carry around with him and hold with him and add to. And some of the figures on the court cards of the minor arcana really look like they're drawn from life, possibly friends, maybe models. Right. And
you've got your facsimile set here. Can I have a quick look? Whilst you're rooting it out, I'll just tell a little bit of the next part of the story, because as a consequence to you discovering it and the importance of it, you know, which is recognised by other people too, then you wrote the book Lost Envoy. Jonathan's just passed me his facsimile set.
I should just say something about this, because it's a rather kind of rough and ready object. The reason I produced this was as soon as I started experimenting with the marginal motifs, the technology at the edges of the cards, it was obvious that in order to examine this object fully, you had to have a kind of haptic contact with it.
Haptic means?
So by hand, by physical contact, by hand, through handling. And I suppose in a way, thinking about it, thought about it that way, I needed to carry it around in the way that Spare must have done.
Right.
You know, we don't know when he passed it on to one of the Collings brothers, but there's a good chance that he, carried it around with him in Southwark for a good number of years, doing readings. As he's learning about the art himself, and drawing across the boundaries and so forth. And
it's a lovely thing. I mean, you're absolutely right, because the little heads, the portraits that are on there, they actually do look like they're from life. I mean, there's ghosts and strange creatures wobbling around too, but the portraits have this feeling of kind of verite about them. I mean, and it's a delightful thing. And I think, in a way, as we're running out of time, that is a perfect time to deal you the final card, Jonathan, which is that Lost Envoy, the book came out and it's sold out very quickly.
Actually, the editor of the book, Lost Envoy, obviously I initiated the project, but my expertise around Spare was, had its limits, particularly around Spare's relationship to cartomancy. So the book is a collation of contributions from a wide range of authors, including two Spare scholars, Phil Baker, who we've been talking about a lot, Gavin Semple, who had actually written the only previous treatment of Spare's relationship to cartomancy in the 90s, but obviously didn't include the deck because he didn't know about it, and Helen Farley, who is a cultural historian who sort of set the deck in a cultural history of tarot. There's a number of existing texts, one from Magic Circle curator Arthur Ivy, 200 words about the deck in 1968. Spare's own writing on cartomancy in the 1950s, which shines a light back on the deck in very interesting ways. We invited the writer Sally O'Reilly to produce a text of speculative fiction around an encounter she came up with between Austin Spare and Sylvia Pankhurst, in which the deck features.
Excellent.
And then a wonderful piece by Alan Moore, where he wonderfully asks Aleister Crowley's deck what the future provenance and the future of Austin Spare's deck is. So he's asking one tarot deck about the future of another tarot deck.
Classic Alan Moore there. Love it.
And illustrated by Kevin O'Neill as well. That's the other.
The new edition is that plus more, plus the other information that you found out since and various other things. And of course, the very special thing about it is that in addition to the book, there is
a facsimile reproduction of the deck itself. And that has proved an incredible technical challenge because specifically of these marginal details of the card, which anybody who knows anything about printing will know the clearances and the margins at the edges of printed material are very tricky to manage at that kind of detail. And given that there's individual words and details of images right on the borders of the cards, it's been a real challenge. But we think we're on top of that. Both of those projects together ended up being a significant financial challenge. So we launched a Kickstarter campaign about 3 weeks ago now,
which is already, I can tell you, it's already thriving. And I'm just going to encourage people, if you're interested, if you're a Spare fan and didn't know about this already, or you've been intrigued by what you've heard today, I'll put a link to the Kickstarter and to Jonathan's work in the show notes, because it is going to be a little cultural treasure, I think. And are you actually there? Are you over the Kickstarter ridge into it's definitely happening?
I think probably 4/5 of the way there now.
Okay. So much kind of interest and love for the project, isn't there already,
Yeah.
and for him and stuff,
Yeah.
and what you've already uncovered. And it's such an amazing story, Jonathan. And I think also you mentioned earlier, which I was very pleased to hear, that the Magic Circle have got no intention to sell this thing, which
Who knows?
Right.
I mean, that may change, but I think as the Magic Circle recognise the treasure in its midst, and the fact that it brings a very different range of visitors into the building, and the Magic Circle Museum itself is sort of moving into a slightly different relationship with its audiences anyway.
Sure.
And so I think it would be a mistake to sell it, and I don't think there's any intention to sell it.
Well, let's hope if they ever need to or decide to, that it actually goes into the V&A or something, or some other public institution, rather than getting snaffled up by one of the very eager collectors who include some famous people like Jimmy Page and stuff, don't they?
I mean, Spare's still, despite the recent interest in his work, and certainly the recent market interest in his work, has still sort of slipped the net of critical acknowledgement by the British Art Institution. I mean, there's a number of reasons for that, but I think that's only a matter of time, simply because of the power of the work. I mean, I think, if you only got to stand in front of a really strong Spare drawing, and they've got the authority on the surface of early Lucien Freud, and
if that happens, they will explode for sure. So, Jonathan, thank you very much for coming to the Bureau of Lost Culture to talk about this wonderful piece of lost or semi-forgotten, half-remembered culture. We're looking forward to the new edition of Lost Envoy and this wonderful reproduction of the work. So thanks a lot.
Thank you.
Thanks to Jonathan for that brief introduction to Austin Osman Spare and his wonderful tarot deck. Thanks to Jonathan also for rediscovering it and researching it and bringing it back into the light. As much as I do, there's nothing better, is there, than lost treasure seekers. And of course, here at the Bureau of Lost Culture, there's nothing we like better than a tale of lost culture, lost arcana, lost esoterica. Austin Spare is a fascinating character for many, many reasons. Particularly, I would say, because of his work. It's beautiful. If you're not familiar with it, do check it out. I urge you also to check out this Kickstarter campaign to bring his tarot deck back in a reproduced form into the world. It's a wonderful thought to think of it being out there and people using it to tell their own futures, to divine their own meanings or those of others. As well as anything else, it's a very strange and beautiful object, as you'll see if you check out the campaign. I'll put a note to that, of course, in the show notes. Thank you for listening. I hope that your future holds many wonderful and meaningful things. In our future, we'll be back with another guest to hear more stories from the other side. Thanks for listening. Leave us a review somewhere. Tell a countercultural friend. Write to us and let us know who you'd like to hear about at the Bureau of Lost Culture, or join us in any other way that you'd like. I think we should finish with a tune. Here is the artist, The Real Tuesday World, with another track from their Lost Future album, Junk Shop Melodies. This is called The Return of the Flea. See you next time.